The world was introduced to the video game series Fallout 25 years ago today, with the first game in the series being released October 10th, 1997. And what better way to celebrate a quarter century of this legendary game series than to look back on its history? What makes this game so beloved and endearing, and what might be ahead for the future with the ups and downs that we've seen recently, but how dedicated this fan base is. Now, for me personally, my personal history parallels a lot of people's in that I didn't really play Fallout in the 90s. My introduction to the game series was Fallout 3, and I absolutely loved it. It was my first true RPG as well. I played open world games, of course, most notably Grand Theft Auto, but I never really played an RPG, and I absolutely loved it. I loved the freedom of it. It was such a unique experience for someone like me who's never played anything like that, and I immediately fell in love with it and became a dedicated fan. So afterwards, I of course wanted to explore the series even more, so I played Fallout New Vegas. I went back and played Fallout 1, Fallout 2, and really just absorb the lore, absorb this kind of alternate history of the United States and the world that this game presented, and it was just an absolutely amazing experience. And then it came to waiting. I waited around for Fallout 4, and this kind of coincided with different aspects of my life where I was about a year or two out of college, really figuring out the real world and negotiating that, getting my first job as a journalist. It comes out, and I loved it. At first, I kind of thought of it as kind of my favorite game in the series, and that opinion has kind of fallen to the wayside now. I now think that Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas are much better games, but you know, at the time it was new and shiny, and Fallout 4 really captured my imagination. The reason my opinion isn't as positive as it was, once people started pointing out the issues with the game, I couldn't look at the game the same way because I agreed. I would love to say, oh, I didn't agree with it. I just ignore it and just be like, oh, they're just being critics. But a lot of what they were saying was true. One of the biggest issues I had was that a lot of the RPG elements were watered down. This was a criticism I heard. It was a criticism I couldn't deny. And I was like, well, one of the reasons I liked Fallout 3 and New Vegas so much was it really did feel like I was crafting this world myself, that my actions were playing this important role, and that I was choosing my own story, and you didn't feel that as strongly with Fallout 4. And there was other stuff too. Some of the retcons with the lore, once they were pointed out, they were hard to ignore. So yes, how positive I am about the game is not as strong, but I still very much love the game. For what it is, it's a worthy addition to the franchise. There's just a big asterisk next to it, which is just be prepared that this is not as heavy an RPG as some of the other games in the series, and as long as you're willing to overlook that, it's a very fun game. Then I started the waiting game again. You hear little rumors here like, oh, they're gonna release a spin-off title game similar to New Vegas, but takes place in New Orleans. And then you start hearing that they were getting the original programmers for New Vegas to do a New Vegas 2, and you're hearing all this different stuff, these different rumors, and they're all very exciting, they're great, but there was nothing really concrete, so you kind of had to take everything with a grain of salt. However, being on kind of the hype train at the time, it was very much fun to kind of listen and read about these type of rumors, and a lot of them did seem promising. I still think that a Fallout that takes place in New Orleans would just be absolutely phenomenal. But, we'll see if that ever ends up happening. Along the way, you started to hear rumors about online Fallout, and that was interesting. So I was not really on board with that. I thought, if they want to do just a small thing, sure. But I thought one of the strengths of the series itself was this feeling of isolation. You're the lone wanderer. You're this person who's surviving the waste. Maybe you have a companion with you. Maybe you have your dog with you. But for the most part, it's this very stoic, very miserable, lonely existence. At least that's how I play the games. And I think that's how a lot of people play the games too. But I wasn't completely opposed. And then we started getting more concrete information, and then we got the announcement of Fallout 76, and I was like, oh, this seems like a lot of work for a multiplayer game. I wish they just put it into a spin-off title like a New Vegas 2 or New Orleans, and I'd much rather if them just did a multiplayer Fallout 4, but whatever. And then what got me excited is when Todd Howard said, you don't have to play this multiplayer. And I was like, oh, that's great. Cool. If this is just a single player game that has a multiplayer option, great. I'm all for that. That didn't end up being completely truthful. Yeah, you didn't have to play multiplayer, but you had to play online with other people. So it was like, I suppose technically Todd Howard wasn't lying, but it was kind of a lie, right? It was kind of to shut up people like me who didn't want to see this massive game be multiplayer only. Online is still multiplayer. It's just not local multiplayer, but whatever. So that happened. I'm like, okay, well, it can still be a good game, but as we got closer to the release, I started getting that kind of gut feeling, that sixth sense you kind of get. You're like, oh, something's not right. This is not going to be a good game. And it's like, okay, still hold out hope. And then when you start getting the reviews in from the early release folks, and then it opened to the general public, and you start getting all those videos and stuff, it was just a complete disaster. And obviously, we don't need to go through the full history, but it was a pretty epic failure. And even as the game was improving, for a while I was refusing to get it because I didn't want to reward what I saw as very much anti-consumer behavior. And matter of fact, I only just bought Fallout 76 a month ago. And it's exactly what I thought it would be. The positive is I'm very much enjoying exploring the world. There is a lot of beautiful set pieces. It's a very big world. It's a very beautiful map, and it's very fun to explore. But most of the missions aren't really pulling me in. And just keep in mind, I kind of imagine how boring this game is before NPCs. I didn't play the game at that time. There's NPCs around, and there's the Wastelanders expansion pack and stuff like that, so there is those new stories here, but nothing's really pulling me in. Every single main quest of every other game pulled me in, some more than others, but they all pulled me in to some degree. Wastelanders isn't really pulling me in, though I'm playing it, and the Overseer quest, the original quest, or at least as far as I know is the original quest, is just not pulling me in at all. Another negative is seeing other players, which is, that's the whole point of Fallout 76. It's an online game. But sometimes I'll go like a few hours, because it's a big map, I'll go a few hours without seeing another player, and I'll actually start to get immersed again, which is what you want with this game series. I'll forget that I'm playing a game, and it will feel like a Fallout game again, because I'm immersed in the story, and then all of a sudden, some guy jumps out of the woods, and the name over his head is, Big Titties 69 or something like that, and it completely takes me out of the story. Just completely takes me out of whatever I'm doing, whether it's exploring or something. I actually think it would have been better if they had to really do online and other players were there. Don't put the names over the head like that. Make them look like NPCs, and you have to actually talk to them before you actually know whether they're another player or not. I think that would have been a better way to go about it, but either way, that just takes me out of my immersion completely. Those are my two big negatives. The three main quests aren't really engaging at all. Some of the side quests are. Seeing other players takes me out of my immersion, but the biggest positive is the exploration. I do enjoy exploring the map and finding the different things there is to find. Now that's kind of my history with the series up until this point. I love the series, however, like many fans, I have noticed a little bit of a drop in quality in recent years, kind of starting with Fallout 4, but getting much worse after that. I don't think it's terrible at this point, although I do think Bethesda's kind of in the red and they have to do something really good for the next game. Or the television series, that's coming up, and obviously we've talked about that on the channel too, so that could be another thing that really excites the fans again, though I think it has to be a game. A television series is cool, but this is a game series through and through, and the next game has to be really good. Now, talking about the exploration of Fallout 76 is a good segue to what I think is my favorite part and many people's favorite part of the game, and that's one word: exploration. That comes in many forms. It's the exploration of the map. It's the exploration of the story and the side quest. And it's the exploration of the lore. One of the fun things about this series is discovering little bits of history about the world and, the alternative timeline and how the world ended up the way it is, the Great War and what led to the Great War and what happened after, and the impact of the Master on the wasteland of the West Coast. And all this stuff is incredibly interesting, and basically the lore and the world building is the story above the story. It's the overarching story that ties everything together, which is good because the individual stories in each game, they're kind of their own thing in a lot of ways, because each game has its own main character. So it's kind of cool to have this overarching story, and as there's this overarching story, there's also these individual stories within each game. And then also the small stories are fun to explore, like finding a skeleton and the stuff around them. You can start to pick up little clues of what happened to them, or maybe they have a holotape next to them and you can actually hear their voice. What were their final thoughts before the nukes fell? And there's a lot of sad stories in this wasteland. If you're paying attention, you can find a lot of sad, interesting stories mixed in. There's all this different stuff, but then you also see hopefulness that there's all these years later, hundreds of years later, there's still people trying to help. There's also terrible people in the wasteland, raiders, people who own slaves, all this stuff, all the horrors of humanity you can possibly imagine are still there. But along the way, there's also all this good stuff, the good people that are trying to do their best. And I think, for me, that is what makes this series so great. It's exploration. It's exploring these different things, whether they're just little throwaway scenes with skeletons or whatever, or they're discovering the actual bigger story. This stuff is great. It's fun to explore the wasteland, whether it's the Capital Wasteland, the Commonwealth, the Mojave Wasteland, whatever it may be. These places are fun to explore, and the little stories you find along the way are fun to discover. And I think that's what makes the game so great for so many people. It's not the looting shooting stuff. I actually think looting shooting on its own is kind of boring. I think games like Borderlands are kind of boring, to be completely honest with you. It means nothing if there isn't a really engaging, interesting story to grab onto. But games like Fallout are fun. For their ups and downs, that engaging story is what's interesting. And that's what I hope Bethesda understands. I know there's people like Pete Hines who seem to not really care about the lore at all, or they're not the lore guy, or whatever his quote was. And okay, fine, but I hope there's enough people at Bethesda that understand that there are a lot of people like me who don't care about the looter shooter stuff, who are here to explore the smaller stories and the bigger story, that the lore matters to us. And I'm sure there are. I'm sure there's a lot of people at Bethesda that do. For Todd Howard being a alleged liar about a lot of things, it bends the truth a little bit, I'll say that. He does seem to actually genuinely like the series, and that's cool. But I do have hope. But with the retcons recently, with the Brotherhood of Steel showing up in Appalachia, even though that game takes place like only 20 years after the war, there's like little stuff like that does make me worry that Bethesda isn't caring as much about the lore. Though I think we're just in a weird spot right now. I think the fan base surviving Fallout 76, people in a weird position. There's people who've completely given up on the franchise, I'm sure. There's people like me who's kind of hopeful but waiting for the next game, waiting to see what the pattern is. And then there's obviously those people that will enjoy everything that Bethesda releases, and you don't really have to worry about them because they're happy, and I'm happy that they're happy. But from people like me who are in the middle group, I don't want to give up hope on this series, but I do want the next game to really prove itself. There's a lot to be hopeful, there's a lot to look forward to, but there's also a lot to be cautious about. And that's where I'm at as a fan right now, and I think a lot of people are. Based on what I'm reading online and stuff like that, I think a lot of people are in that position. They're excited, they want to keep being fans, but whatever the next game is, whether it's New Vegas 2 or whatever, it has to be a good game. And hopefully Bethesda understands that. And part of it being a good game is to actually take the lore seriously and try not to retcon things. But, you know, that's kind of my thoughts on what Fallout is, why it's important to me, and where I think the game series is at this point. So happy 25 years to this legendary game series.